So in today's video, I am going to show you how I make sourdough bread, like sourdough sandwich bread in a loaf rather than the artisan kind of sourdough bread. So in 2020, when we were quarantined and had to stay at home, I jumped on the sourdough bandwagon, and a friend of mine gave me a little bit of sourdough starter, and I fed it and nurtured it. And I still remember the very first sourdough loaves that I made were the crusty artisan kind of sourdough loaves, and I was so proud. And unfortunately, my family didn't really care for that kind of sourdough bread, and I went back for a while. I went back to making my regular yeast bread because that's what the family was used to. And then I found my friend Kate at Venison for Dinner, and I will tag her Instagram account, and I will also link her YouTube account in the description for you. But she has developed this recipe for sourdough sandwich bread, and even more so than any of the yeast bread recipes that I have used, this bread stays soft. And we put butter on it when we're done baking it, so it's not crusty, and the family really likes this. So I am going to make Kate's recipe for soft sourdough bread today, and I'm going to try to explain the steps very well, but I'll also link her recipe in the description so that if you do better with reading instructions, you can go there. And the one thing about the recipe that I realized when I was done filming is that the recipe on her blog makes one loaf. So when I copied it down into my personal cookbook, I doubled it for 2 loaves. And I didn't realize that after all this time, I was actually quadrupling her recipe. So my recipe is written down for 2 loaves, but when I make it, I actually double my recipe, which makes 4 loaves. So that is a little bit of a mistake I made when I was filming. I just thought I'm doubling her recipe. So you'll hear me say I'm doubling her recipe, but I'm actually doubling the recipe that I wrote down. So I'll link everything so that you can read her instructions, and I'll be as thorough as I can with my instructions. But let's make some sourdough bread. So on Sunday night, I get my refrigerated starter out of the refrigerator and set it on the counter. And that is step 1 for making my sourdough sandwich bread. Okay, so now that our starter has warmed up to room temperature, and at this point, you're not gonna see any activity in the starter jar, but the only point was for us to warm it up to room temperature, and that happened overnight. So I've got my scales here, and you really don't have to have a scales. The scales just gave me more confidence, and I'll put the measurements down in units as well, but I'm gonna use all of this sourdough starter, and it should be about 50 grams. I gotta switch my scales to grams. And if it's not quite 50 grams, we're not gonna worry about it. So I've got about 48 grams of starter, but we're gonna pretend it's 50 grams because that's what I usually go with. And then I'm gonna zero my scales. And because I wanna make a double recipe of soft sourdough bread, like the sandwich bread, I'm going to add, so I have 50 grams of starter. That means I want 100 grams of flour. So 100 grams of flour is about 3/4 cup, but that can all change depending on how you measure your flour. It can change a lot. So, and that's why most people use a scale, is because it's much more accurate than using units to measure. So now I'm gonna zero my scales again. And then I want 100 grams of water. And 100 grams of water was about exactly one half cup of water. So now I'm just gonna stir this all together. So we're just gonna stir it until it's all incorporated. There's no dry spots of flour, but it definitely does not have to be smooth. So now that we've got that all mixed together, we're just gonna put a little jar bonnet on it, and we're going to set it in a warm spot in the house. What was I gonna say? Oh, I always like to use a wide mouth jar. A wide mouth quart jar works too, but this is actually a jar that I use for yogurt, but a wide mouth jar just makes it so much easier for me to get in and out, and it doesn't have all these corners to scrape out. So now we're just gonna set it right beside the refrigerator so it can be nice and warm. And the water that I used in here was a little warmer than room temperature. It was between 75 and 80 degrees. And that's not so warm that it'll kill your starter, and it's just warm enough to really get it going. And if I want it to be slower, I'll use cold water. But normally I use water that's just a little more than room temperature. So now I just set it right next to the refrigerator here because the refrigerator is warm. So it is about 8 o'clock at night, and my sourdough has been growing all day. And this is what it looks like. Or I should say my starter has been growing all day. And the recipe calls for 2 cups of active sourdough starter. So I'm going to use all of this. And if I were to measure this, I would only have about a cup, because when I start stirring it, it kind of goes flat and you really don't have that much. But it normally doesn't matter, or it rarely matters. So all that's left in there is what I'm gonna use to start my next batch of sourdough starter. So I've got 2 cups of active starter and 2 cups of water, warm water. And again, this is just a little more than room temperature. And remember, I'm making a double recipe. So now I need 3 cups of all-purpose flour. Oh, I forgot that one doesn't fit. So 1, 2, and 3. And this is my pre-ferment. So I'm just going to mix all this together. Until it's not going to be smooth by any means, but you're not gonna have any spots of dry flour. So that's my pre-ferment. And I'm just gonna cover this with some wax paper or a wax covering. And this is a wax covering from Prairie Bee Wraps. And I'm gonna link them in the description. And we're just gonna let this set on the counter overnight. And that's gonna ferment. So now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm gonna take everything that's left in this jar, which is, it's just a little bit. It's really not much. But I'm gonna feed what's left in this jar. I'm gonna take about a fourth a cup of flour. And a little less water than a fourth a cup. And I'm just gonna stir that all around in there. I'm gonna scrape the sides down. And then I'm gonna look at it and I'm gonna say that it looks just a little wet. So I'm gonna put in a little more flour. And I'm gonna keep mixing it until it looks like what I want. So this is the starter for the next batch of sourdough. And I scraped all of the active starter together. And I'm just gonna put the cover back on. There was enough active starter left in that jar to get this going. So I'm just gonna put the cover back on and put it right back next to the refrigerator until tomorrow morning. Good morning. So the kids are off to school and I'm gonna get this bread dough started. My pre-ferment is looking lovely. Look at all those beautiful bubbles in there. I like to use a glass dish because it gives me a visual of how beautiful that pre-ferment is. And then I've got my mixer out, and I'll link this mixer. This is the Bosch 800 watt. And I've got some milk and honey and butter. And we're gonna get started with the next step in making our sourdough sandwich bread. So first of all, I'm going to melt together my 4 tablespoons of butter, and remember I'm making a double recipe, so okay, there's my 4 tablespoons of butter, and you know what, I'm just going to use the rest of that just to finish that off. And then I need about 4 tablespoons of honey. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm going to melt this together, and then I'll add my milk. So I'm just gonna add my butter. I'm just gonna melt my butter and honey together until it's smooth. And now that that's all melted, I'm gonna add my 3 cups of milk. So there's 2. And 3. And now we just want to bring this up to about 100 degrees. And the heat of this will just help your bread dough get a nice warm start. Okay, you can tell that the butter is mostly melted, and this is a good sign that my milk and honey and butter temperature is coming up there to where I need it to be. And it's right around 100 degrees. It looks a little off here in the camera, but it's a little over 100 degrees, so we're gonna call that good. So now I'm gonna put in my lovely pre-ferment. And then I'm gonna add my warm milk mixture. So oftentimes the pre-ferment and the milk mixture don't really mix well until I start adding some flour. So if you can't get your pre-ferment and your milk mixture to mix in real well, it's okay. It'll get mixed together when you add your flour. The other thing that I wanted to tell you about milk is I just used fresh raw milk today, but I really like to use fermented milk products when I have them on hand. Like buttermilk or clabber makes your bread so fluffy, and it just makes your bread dough so very active and responsive, and it rises and ferments so fast when you use a bit of fermented milk, like buttermilk or cultured milk, like clabber or buttermilk. Or sometimes I'll even put a little dab of yogurt in just to help it get fermenting. So I need a total of about 10 cups of flour. So first of all, I'm gonna add 5. I'm gonna add about half the flour. And then I'm gonna get it mixing until it's all smooth. So now that my dough is the flour is all incorporated and the dough looks smooth, I'm gonna add 4 more cups of flour. I always go scant on the flour at first because it's much easier to add more flour to a batter that is too wet than it is to take flour out of a recipe. So this is the point where I realized that I forgot to add salt. Normally I add my salt to the honey and butter and milk mixture and let the salt dissolve in the warm milk, but I forgot that, so I'm putting it in now. So I have about 1 cup less of flour in than the recipe asks for, and we're getting close to the right consistency. So I'm only gonna add a little bit more flour, and then I'm gonna let it knead for quite a while. So I'm gonna sprinkle about 1/4 cup in there, and then I'm gonna let it knead for about 10 minutes. So anytime you think your dough feels too sticky, always err on the side of more kneading rather than more flour, because too much flour will cause a bread to be real dry and crumbly, and more kneading really doesn't hurt. And kneading is really where you develop the gluten, and the gluten is what helps the bread stay nice and soft. Okay, so this has been kneading for about 10 minutes, and you can see how beautiful, smooth, and stretchy it is. Now it's a little sticky, but I don't mind that. I'm not gonna add any more flour because it's beautiful and stretchy. And when I stretch it, it mostly stays smooth. So I'm gonna call this ready for the first rise. So when we add a liquid to flour, we start the development of the protein chain, which we also call developing the gluten. So then when we knead, we break down this protein further, which helps it develop an even bigger protein chain, which is developing the gluten. The next step in developing the gluten will be allowing it to rise. So I've got my large stainless steel bowl that I'm gonna put my bread dough in. And like I said, it's gonna be a little sticky, but that's okay. I don't mind if it's a little sticky. So I'm just gonna flour my hands a little and work it a little bit to keep it from sticking to the sides. And also I like to practice feeling my dough when it's at this stage, so that I know what it's supposed to feel like, so that my brain remembers what a good bread dough should feel like. What I'm looking for most is that it's nice and smooth. You can see how smooth this is. So you might end up adding more flour than I did, and that's okay. You add as much as you need to get your dough to this point. Everybody measures flour a little differently, and that is why I put less in, because I must have been measuring heavier. But the key is practice, because when you practice, you really kind of stop counting cups of flour after a certain point, and you just look at what your dough feels like. Like I count, normally I count cups of flour up until about 8 cups for a 10-cup recipe of bread. And then after 8 cups, I just go by what it feels like and what it looks like for me. So now I am just gonna cover this bowl with my wax paper again. And this is going to, by sealing this, you trap the moisture in there, because bread dough or sourdough or yeast dough needs two things to enable it to proof or rise. And those two things that it needs are humidity and heat. So by closing this real tight, you're trapping the humidity from the dough in there, and then I'm gonna set it on our heated floor, and that is going to be just the right amount of warmth that it needs to proof. Okay, this is the sourdough starter. That was the bits and pieces that I scraped together and fed last night. It's nice and active, so this is a good time for me to put it in the refrigerator until I'm ready to bake again. Now I'm just gonna tuck this right into the refrigerator until I'm ready to bake some more bread, and then I'll get it out about 24 hours before I'm ready to make my pre-ferment. And I'll start right away with step one, which is just get it out on a Sunday night and set it on the counter to bring it up to room temperature. So the only time I would continue to feed this starter is if I wanted to collect a lot of discard to make recipes with discard. But right now my discard jar is full, so I'm not going to continue to feed this. I'm just gonna tuck it into the refrigerator, and then when I want to bake bread again, I will get it out and I will have zero discard. So I ended up having to go to town for something, and the bread dough was almost ready, but I wasn't ready, so I'm just gonna punch it down and hopefully it'll stay nice and put until I come back and I'm ready to shape it into loaves. I'm also going to take it out of the sunshine just to slow it down a little bit. Okay guys, it is time. It probably would have been time about 2 hours ago, but I wasn't ready, so I punched it down and it has come back up. It's a beautiful dough. So what we're going to do is divide it in 4. So it's okay if it's a little sticky. I'm just gonna dip my hand in the flour. And I'm just weighing all of these to kind of get them the same size. So I'm gonna get my pans ready. I've got a little bit of melted tallow I'm gonna put in each pan. You can use any kind of oil. I'm just gonna spread the dough out as flat as I can. And then I'm gonna pick it up, turn it into a triangle, turn it into another triangle, and then I'm gonna roll it. And I'm gonna make sure it's all pinched. So now we're just gonna let them rest here again until they are double in size. And really at this point, I still have less than an hour of work into this bread. That's of course not counting filming, because everything takes me a bit longer when I'm filming, but actual work time is less than an hour for these 4 loaves of bread so far. Okay, so this is how I'm gonna test the bread to see if it's ready for baking. So I poke it, and if it comes back out pretty fast, then I know that it's still rising. Let me see if I can make a fresh hole in here. See how fast it comes back out. So once, hey, don't poke. No more poking, no more poking. So once I poke it and it stays in, then I know it's ready. And this is something that you'll learn with more experience too. You can see how it bounces right back out. That means that the dough still has more to give. Okay, the dough's definitely rising. And you can see that now when I poke it, it doesn't have near the spring left that it did earlier. This one's still got some left because I think there was more dough in that one. But it's staying indented longer. And I don't know if I can get this clear now with the lights on. But here you can see how this one is definitely done, because when I poke it, it stays in. So I've got my oven preheating to 475. So now I'm just gonna score my loaves over the top. And I know you can get fancy knives that are made just for this, but I find a simple razor blade works just fine for my scoring. So into the oven they go, and Kate's recipe says to bake them at 375, but I find in my oven that I like 475 better. And it seems like it took so long to get the internal temperature to where I wanted it at 375. And my bread is softer when I bake it hotter and faster. So your oven might be different, but if you're not happy with how your bread's turning out, I would definitely recommend playing around with the temperature and the time a little bit. And I set my timer for 20 minutes, and then after 20 minutes, I rotate my loaves and turn them all the other way just to ensure even baking. So after I've turned the loaves, I set my timer for 15 more minutes, and then after those 15 minutes, I take the internal temperature of my bread. So my bread has been in the oven for 35 minutes now, and I'm looking for the temperature to be between 190 and 200 degrees, and that's how I'll know that the bread is done. If it's not over 190 degrees, I will put it back in and set my timer for another 5 to 10 minutes. So now as soon as they're done baking, I'm just gonna flip them all out of the pans and set them on my cooling rack for them to cool. So because my family does not like crusty bread, I am going to brush the tops with some butter while the bread is still hot, and this will soften that crust. And yes, the butter does drip down onto my stove top, but butter is not something that cannot be cleaned up. A little bit of hot soapy water will wipe this butter right up. So after a couple hours, as soon as the bread is cool, we are going to slice all of it. I like to use my electric carving knife, and we'll slice it all before we put it in the freezer. You can see how nice and soft this bread is. So we're gonna take one loaf and put it in this beeswax bag from Prairie Bees Wraps. And we are going to just put this one in the pantry for eating while it's still fresh. And then we're gonna slice the other 3 loaves. So here you can see again how soft this bread really is. And this is the closest thing to store-bought bread that I have gotten. And that is the one thing that my family disliked about most of the bread that I made at home, was the fact that it wasn't soft. So now that my bread is all sliced, I'm going to put 1 meal's worth of sliced bread in each freezer bag, and that way, by freezing it right after it's made, we are preserving and locking in all of its goodness and freshness. And then we will just grab one of these bags when we need them, and it only takes an hour or so for the sliced bread to defrost on the countertop. And we will keep this sliced bread in the freezer for 2 to 3 weeks. And when we get it out and defrost it, it will taste just as good as fresh. But the trick is to put it in the freezer when it's fresh. So there you have it. There is how we make our sourdough bread. And please don't forget to check out the links in the description. I have links to the Prairie Bee wraps and to Kate's blog where the written recipe is. And then I also have a link for you to sign up for our email list. I've been sending out emails with more detailed information than what I put on here or on Instagram, where Instagram gives me just a limited amount of characters I can use, and most social media platforms don't want to hear about some more conservative views on food and the way it's made. So that is where email comes in, and I can speak freely in those emails. And anyway, those links will all be in the description. Thank you so much for watching.